Hello and welcome to week 2. This is a big week. In fact, I really wanted to set the stage. I know you've got a lot to do this week. You've got a podcast to listen to, which is really fun. I mean, you can do that on your way to campus if you commute, or just as you're walking around, you can get some exercise in and listen to the podcast. However, I will say that if you're going to do it while you're kind of in transit or walking or doing something else, whether it's washing dishes or whatever, um, keep in mind that you're going to have to listen to it again if you can't stop and take notes, because in this podcast, she shares a lot of information about. She kind of like primes the pump, if you will, with a lot of new terminology, cognitive redlining, intellectual capacity, so many things that she wants us to start to become aware of. And in addition to just kind of like setting the stage and giving her own background story. And so there's a lot to do. Then you have chapters 1 and 2 to read, which are chock full of information in our wonderful book. And so, be ready with your pencil and notebook, because there's so much to take in. And then there's another article about strategies for being a culturally responsive teacher. So, and then some kind of like bonus materials I've put on our Moodle page for the week. So there's a lot to take in, and I want you reflecting on all of it. So give yourself adequate time this week to really try to really, take time with the reading and the listening and viewing and reflecting on all of it, what it means for you as a teacher. Okay, some of the terminology, I already mentioned cognitive redlining. In the interview, I want you to pay particular attention to concepts like productive struggle. This will come up again in the book, and it's something that you really want to facilitate in your classroom. Productive struggle sounds like an oxymoron, right? But it's actually something that we want to facilitate. Learning should be fun. It should be active. It should be tied into student interests whenever possible, but it's also hard work, right? Growing our brains is hard work. Developing expertise is hard work. And we want our students to understand that. Like, this isn't all fun and games. Sometimes you really have to buckle down and wrestle with concepts, or wrestle with things that don't make sense to you, or you're not sure how to think about. So productive struggle is a really important concept for you to understand as a teacher. Liberatory learning is a concept that she drew from Paulo Freire and his Pedagogy of Oppressed. And so this is a really important idea for you to understand. And I put another article, if you want to learn more about what this is. The article is by her. It's put out by the American Federation of Teachers. And it really kind of describes the kind of stage that you want to set in your classroom. What should learning be about? Not just meeting the Common Core standards, right? We're setting people up for their future lives. And so we want them to realize their potential, and all of that is embraced in liberatory learning. Cognitive redlining, I mentioned, but you should really make sure that you understand what this means after listening to the podcast and then reading the first 2 chapters. Redlining you may have heard about before. In the past, it's been more of a real estate concept, where banks would not give, they actually had maps where they would draw red lines around neighborhoods where they would not give mortgages to Black and brown families. And so those areas were restricted. It's systemic racism. It still exists today. Not that kind of redlining that where banks are forbidden from doing that practice anymore. However, that idea of redlining still happens. It happens in our school systems. So open your minds to that, and you're going to be blown away. Another thing that I think is really important from both the interview and the first 2 chapters is this idea of the pedagogy of compliance. And that's where, unfortunately, when it comes to Black and Brown students, we are sometimes more concerned about them obeying, and more focused on their behavior than on their learning. And so I want you to really try to understand what she's talking about here and where it's coming from. It's very powerful. There was a Yale study. I'll actually put a link to that study in the on our Moodle page as well if you're not aware of it. Something like 143 teachers, I think that's it, preschool teachers, both Black and white, were asked to watch students through a one-way mirror that were playing, preschoolers that were playing. And they said that the study was about, all they said was the study was about inappropriate behaviors, problematic behaviors. And they just wanted the teachers to spend a few minutes before they got into the study observing the students. Well, what they did is they took this technology that tracked where the teachers were looking. And the majority of teachers, Black and white, were focused on the little Black boys in the room. There were Black and white boys, Black and white girls, preschoolers. And so what that says is that the teachers were expecting that the problematic behavior was going to come from the little Black boys. This is astonishing, right? This is unconscious. Teachers weren't aware that they were doing this. And so what that says, we said at the very beginning of this course that teaching is a reflective practice, and we need to really reflect on what might our biases be, because that will impact how much our students can learn, how well they are able to reach their potential. So it's very, very powerful. She talks all about how education is inequitable by design, and she brings it to life with her own experiences. So really take that in and understand why she's able to make this statement today. Okay, so she also talks about in this podcast about what the brain's doing, and she's going to dive in heavy duty in chapter 3 on what the brain is actually doing. But she kind of like primes the pump a little bit and says, look, we know from neuroscience that when students are actively reading and learning, they are trying to make connections. Piaget theorized this, right? 100 years ago. So what she is saying, not 100 years ago, but many, many years ago. And so what she is saying is actually neuroscience has actually showed us that that students, when they're reading, they're trying to make connections to things they already know. Assimilating that knowledge. They're also looking for what's relevant to their lives. So the brain is actively doing these things that we don't even tell it to do. And so that I think you're going to find really fascinating. What is cultural responsiveness? How does it improve teaching for all students? Similar to the concept of, what is it called? Universal design. That was an architectural concept where it became important for, and actually then federal law, for sidewalks to have cutouts. And public doors into public buildings to have a button that you could press that would open the door, right? Elevators. All these things made buildings more accessible, sidewalks, public spaces more accessible. Well, but then what we found out was that it actually benefited everyone, not just the disabled, right? Moms in their strollers benefit from those curb cutouts, from those buttons that open the door for you. People on bicycles, the elderly, anybody that's got their hands full, right, will benefit from one of those buttons. So this is the same thing with cultural responsiveness. When you read that article about cultural responsiveness strategies, you're going to be saying to yourself, well, yeah, this is just good practice, right? Yeah. It is. This is something that will benefit all of our students. There's a reason, a cultural reason for a lot of them, but they will benefit the practices will benefit every single student that you have. And so taking a culturally responsive perspective and adopting those particular responses is going to benefit everyone. Okay, she talks a little bit about, and she talks later in the book more about this, but says, like post-COVID, we got into, oh, we've got to extend reading and math. And actually, it was happening before COVID, if we're honest, because of the global rankings, right? We started participating in these tests that 15-year-olds would take. And I think like 80 countries around the world now participate in them. And you would think the US is really high on those rankings lists. Well, they're not. We rank somewhere between 35 and 40th in reading and math, which is astonishing. And so it started making us think we need to spend more time on reading and math. Do we really though? Is that the problem, that we're not spending enough time? This is how schools have addressed it. And so you'll see all over the place, you'll see 90 minutes a day being spent on reading, 90 minutes a day being spent on math. And she maintains that's not the key. We should be actually chunking up our instruction in 15-minute components, because again, what we know from neuroscience is that kids need time, the brain needs time to process this new information. And so if we're keeping them engaged or trying to keep them engaged for an hour, they're not learning all of that, right? So this is something you're just going to find fascinating. Dopamine hit. She talks about this. Dopamine is a brain chemical, a neurochemical, and is something that you want your kids to get in your classroom when they're learning. When do we get dopamine hits? When we're scrolling, right? We're constantly looking for the next thing. We want that, like, oh, that was funny, or whatever. Your kids are looking for this. Your students need this. And so we've got to design instruction that is going to get kids curious, is get them wanting to work hard, motivate them to want to learn more. So pay attention to when she's talking about how to get that dopamine hit coming in your classroom. Speaking of the classroom, she talks about preparing the dojo. Like this is from the Karate Kid, where they actually worked in a real dojo, right? And so think of yourself as Mr. Miyagi. I think his name was Mr. Miyagi. Mr. Miyagi. Mr. Miyagi. Miyagi. Oh my God. I think it's Miyagi, actually. Mr. Miyagi. And how he taught the student. He didn't sit whatever the student's name was, the Karate Kid, down at a desk and give him a worksheet and say, let me tell you about the history of karate. He gave him things to do that would build the skills, right, for karate in a really interesting, engaging, meaningful way. So pay attention when she starts talking about how to prepare your dojo. She talks about how we need to become racially literate. This is something you need to start being intentional about today. You probably have been already, but you really need to be thinking about, because you don't want that implicit bias that we saw in those Yale study teachers. You don't want that kind of bias to impact how you interact with your students, right? It's going to affect how they learn. She's going to start giving you strategies in the podcast and then in chapters 1 and 2 about how to think about time. I started talking about that already, about chunking it rather than extending it. Getting kids to embrace the struggle, that productive struggle, right? And then doing what we can to produce those dopamine hits and motivating students. In chapter 1, she really dives into this idea of why culturally responsive teaching is important. She defines it for us. She gives us plenty of evidence, like the school to prison pipeline, like schools, underprivileged schools, and how they work at lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy. So even though, ever since Brown versus the Board of Ed in 1954, we are not supposed to have unequal schools, but we do. Bottom line. So pay very attention to these concepts in chapter 1, intellective capacity. Her Ready for Rigor framework. I've given you an idea that I want you to do. It's actually one of the questions that you have to answer after your reading. Study her Ready for Rigor framework and then set it side by side with the Charlotte Danielson framework for teaching that I've put on our Moodle page. This has been used for decades now to evaluate teachers. So your principal will use it to evaluate you. What Hammond has done has, she has embedded it with more about what we know. You'll see they're very similar frameworks, but she's really upgraded it to take into account what we know about learning in the brain and culturally responsive teaching. So I think you're going to find it really, really informative. It's a wonderful framework. And so start trying to get a handle on what the components of that framework are. Reflecting. We talked about this in the beginning of the course last week. And so you see someone here journaling with a cup of coffee, do that every day, right? Sit and think about what you're learning, about what it means for you as a person, as a human, and as a teacher. Chapter 2, this is a little link actually to Tina Turner's What's Love Got to Do with It. It's actually something I play when I teach this in person, but really she's diving deep into culture. What does culture mean? And she talks about the two different cultural archetypes, individualism and collectivism, and where each country falls in. And I want you to just look through that table because it's really, really interesting. And how she describes an individualistic society like the US versus a collective society like Japan or Vietnam or South Korea. And what does that mean for you as a teacher? Because we need to recognize that we may be making assumptions because of the kind of culture we live in about how our students think. And if they come from a more collectivist culture, then we are going to be disappointed, right? Those assumptions are going to be incorrect. So really wrestle with this whole idea, and I think you'll find it very interesting. The other thing that I love in this chapter is the culture tree. Because a lot of times when we talk about honoring culture in our classroom, we talk about the surface things, right? She talks about like how it's fine and good to celebrate cultural holidays, right? And explore different foods from different cultures and traditions and dress. But that's the surface stuff. That culture actually goes way deeper, and that we need to be aware of those different levels of culture. So getting to know your students and their cultures really could benefit from you interacting with their families to find out more about their cultures. So that's one way in which you can start to get at the roots, the cultural roots of your students. And finally, we started to talk about this already. And this whole book, even though it's about how to teach in an elementary classroom, elementary education is not void of socio-political influences, as you know. Children are hungry. Oh, let's have the schools address it, right? There's a food shortage, a food issue. Let's have the schools address that with free breakfast and free lunch. Oh, kids have mental health issues these days. Let's have the schools address that with social emotional learning, which is something you'll be tasked to do. There are so many things where educators are brought into the political arena. And so it's important to recognize that, and to recognize that Um, the schools are proponents of systemic and structural racial racism, and that learning is racialized, right? And we have to recognize that and really think carefully about our role in this, and how we can make sure that we are giving all of our students a fair shot at meeting their potential. And that also includes looking at our own implicit biases. The last thing, I'm going to post these slides because the last thing that I have here is a little video about Jeffrey Canada. I don't know if you've heard about him or his Harlem Promise Zone, but Jeffrey Canada is a brilliant man. He grew up in Harlem and decided to be a teacher and then studied at Harvard, actually did a master's at Harvard, and then created this promise zone in Harlem, which was one city block. And he decided to provide all of the services that the families that lived within that city block would need: childcare, GED classes, interviewing classes, dental clinics, health clinics, anything that those families needed to be able to meet the requirements of their lives. He found a way by going out and raising lots of money to provide for those families, and it made a difference in how their kids were able to learn. So you take the stress out of families, or you help to support families, and it helps their students. It helps the next generation. So there was a book written about him, Waiting for Superman. Oh boy, it's so poignant. And there was a documentary made from that book. Highly recommend both. So this is what I'm going to finish you with today. And good luck. I mean, strap in. You're going to be learning a lot this week and in the coming weeks. And so get out that notebook and pencil and your journal and your cup of coffee and start taking it all in.